In my 70 years, there have been 4 events that really have affected the way I view the United States. The first one was when I was in 8th grade in November of 1963. Sister Marie Simon came down the hall and told our teacher to turn on the television. And we heard the first words of the attempt, what we thought was only an attempt, to assassinate John F. Kennedy. It turned out to be quite real. Then, along the way, there was another event, and that was little more than 4.5 years later, in April of 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in a senseless act of violence. In 2001, on 9/11, there were planes that flew into the World Trade Center. And I remember watching that and just utterly speechless at what was happening. And then this last Wednesday, to see people invade the Capitol. It's interesting that people gave their lives during 9/11 to prevent that plane from reaching the Capitol, and yet our own people invaded and ransacked. It was just unbelievable. I still don't know really what to think about all that, but I know it will be something that I will never forget. Those 4 events really marked my life in this country, and I still recall them very clearly. But there are other events in my life that have marked it in significant ways as well. One of them was in January of 1978. I was ordained a priest at St. Mary's Cathedral in Lansing, and that changed my life forever. Then, before that, in 1961, in March, I was confirmed by Bishop, Donovan. No, it was Donovan. He was an auxiliary in Detroit. And we lived in Mount Clemens, so that's where I was confirmed. I was confirmed by Bishop Donovan. And then before that, Father Schramm in 1959 in May gave me my first communion. And that was very significant in my life because it's then that I really started thinking about becoming a priest. That's where the seed was planted with the gift of the Eucharist. The last event, the 4th one, was something I don't remember at all. It was January 8th of 1951 when I was baptized. I was baptized at St. Augustine Church in Richmond, Michigan by Father Wirstein. I don't know him, and I don't remember the event at all. But it certainly changed my life. My parents, although Father Wirstein cut him a little slack, were kind of slow in getting me baptized. It was 3 weeks after I was born before I was finally baptized. And in those days, those of us who are older know that you did it within weeks, not months, but actually the next week, if at all possible. But it wasn't back then because I was born just before Christmas, and as a consequence, my mother never got out of the hospital until after the 4th Sunday of Advent. The next Sunday was Christmas. The following Sunday was New Year's. And so January 8th was the first time that it was possible to have me baptized because we generally baptize on Sundays. And so that's when I was baptized, or as I used to say when I was a kid, baptized, which my family never let me forget either. You know how families are. It was one of those things that changed my life. I mentioned that my family was a little slow. My father, that bothered him, I know, because people of my generation and older were taught that if children were unbaptized, they couldn't go to heaven, that they went to a place called limbo. And I'm sure some of you have heard of that. And the truth is that that's never been a dogma of the church. It's never even been a doctrine. It's not even really a teaching of the church. If you read the New Catechism of the Catholic Church, you won't even see it mentioned there. And yet, those my age and older were taught like it was gospel. It was just a theory. It's just a theory. What happens when people aren't baptized? Jesus said in John's Gospel to Nicodemus, unless you are born again by water and the Spirit, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So if that's true, then what happens to the unbaptized? And they came up with this idea of limbo. That limbo was, it wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell, it was kind of in between. It was kind of like warm milk on a hot day. It wasn't anything. It certainly wouldn't satisfy. But it was only a theory. The other theory that has long been the belief of the church is that we let God decide those things. That's not our decision. It's God's. And we entrust those who have died without baptism to God's mercy and God's kindness. So, to prevent that from happening is not a good reason to have children baptized. Along the way, we were taught that we should be baptized because we inherit original sin. And that was a reason why we should baptize. And that's not really true either. We don't inherit original sin. We inherit the reasons for the original sin. If you look back in the story of Genesis, the reason why are the first parents in that parable of Adam and Eve, the reason why they fell into sin was quite simple. First of all, they were self-centered. They wanted something that wasn't theirs. They wanted something that didn't belong to them, that wasn't offered to them, that was even forbidden to them. And they took it anyway. And why? Because they wanted to be like gods, the serpent told them. Well, isn't that false pride? Isn't that really terrible that they wanted to be something they weren't? And then they wouldn't accept responsibility for what they had done. Those three things, my sisters and brothers, that self-centeredness, that false pride, and that unwillingness to accept responsibility for what we have done, what was in our control, those are the root of all sin. And you and I inherit that, and I can show you that very clearly. I know that, when I was born, I was terribly self-centered. I thought the world revolved around me, and by God, when I wanted something, you better give it to me. And my dad would talk about that January 1st at 3 a.m, walking the floor with me over and over again as I would not stop crying, And I was the master of my universe, and I was going to make him take care of me. And the rest of my life, I had to learn that I wasn't in charge. The story of how my dad finally solved the problem, I may tell you later, but not now. In any case, he solved the problem, but I was like that for a while. And the rest of my life was learning to live with other human beings and to realize that most of the time, other people come first, not me. And that's the goal of all of us, is to become self-giving instead of self-centered. All of us have this sense of false pride. We have a tendency at times to think ourselves better than we actually are. I look at this, I'm better than them, Really? Really? Yeah, I may be taller than them, but that doesn't make me better. We make these strange comparisons, and it doesn't make me better. I am who I am. And the only thing that matters is that I become a better person. That's all that God asks of me. But we have these illusions about ourselves. And that kind of false pride gets us into trouble again and again and again. We lie because we don't want people to know the truth. Oh, geez. That's the root of my sin. And an unwillingness to accept responsibility for those things that are in my control, that's gotten me into trouble a lot of times over the years. Those three things we inherit: that self-centeredness, that false pride, that unwillingness to accept our responsibility. We inherit that, not the sin of Adam, but we inherit that tendency to sin. And we believe that in baptism, God gives us that grace. Like Isaiah talks about the water that comes down and brings forth an abundance of life. So God intervenes in our life and brings forth in abundance, gives us the power to overcome those tendencies to self-centeredness, false pride, and irresponsibility. He helps us. But is that the only reason we are baptized? Oh, no. It's not even the best reason, because we heard in the gospel how Jesus was baptized. And we know that John was baptizing for the forgiveness of sin. And you know, the early church always had trouble with that gospel, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all testify to the fact that Jesus was baptized by John. And if he was baptized by John, why? I mean, Jesus hadn't sinned. He didn't even have the taint of original sin. You know, he was the Son of God. He was the beloved of God. He was God in our flesh. He was sinless. And so why be baptized? You know, it wasn't about original sin. It was, though, about the beginning of his mission, his purpose for being in this world. And it began there, at his baptism in the Jordan. He was baptized into a mission that would lead eventually to his death in Jerusalem, his resurrection, and then that path of leading us through his Spirit from this world through death to life. That was his mission, to help us in this world to overcome the taint of original sin, to truly live as God's own children. And so in the waters of baptism, we're adopted by God. I always love when it's time and I'm doing baptisms, especially during a liturgy. When I invite the parents to go back to the font, I always say, and now I invite you to come to the font, the womb of the church. Because the early fathers of the church referred to baptism as the womb. For there the water is broken and we are reborn as God's own children. But we are also reborn as those called to live the mission of Christ Jesus, a mission of compassion, a mission of mercy, a mission of love. That's what we are called to do. That's what we are called to be. You know, we're baptized into the mission because you and I are meant to live like Christ. Oftentimes, people will talk about baptism as being a christening, which is okay. It really only refers to that point at which we are anointed on the crown of our head with sacred chrism. But they refer to the whole thing as baptism, and they refer to those long white gowns as baptismal garments. They call them christening gowns. Yeah? And that's okay, because the word christening comes from two words, and it speaks of the whole purpose of baptism, the most important reason for baptizing. Christening comes from two words, Christ-likening. That's what we are to be, like Christ, anointed in his Spirit to be like him in the way we live in this world and continue his mission of kindness and mercy and compassion and love, to continue that in this world. Not to live in fear, but to live as God's own children. Not to live afraid of punishment, but to live as God's own, sent to bring good news to the poor, release to captives, to announce God's favor to all. That's our mission, my sisters and brothers. That's our purpose. That's why we were baptized. It wasn't to prevent me from going to limbo. It wasn't just because I'm tainted with original sin, although certainly that grace of Christ in my life at that point helped me, I hope, to grow to be a better man. But ultimately, it baptized me in the mission of Christ. And all of us, no matter where we live, no matter what we do, you and I all share that mission. For we were all christened, we were all Christ-likened and called to live as God's own. And we celebrate that today. Not just my baptism, but your baptism, the baptism of all those who've come to be those who follow Christ Jesus and seek to live like him and share his mission and purpose in this world.